When I inherited my uncle's land, I thought it would be peaceful. But the HOA Karen across the street wasn't just unhappy about it. She tried to control me, harass me, and even destroy my property. What she didn't know? That land she thought she ruled actually made me her landlord. And when the truth came out, her entire empire came crashing down. When the letter first arrived, I didn't think much of it. A plain envelope, cream-colored and heavy with no return address. Inside, a set of folded papers and the startling news that my great-uncle had passed away, leaving behind a parcel of land in a suburban neighborhood I hadn't visited in over 20 years. The last time I'd been there, I was a child, my parents dragging me along for family reunions that always felt suffocating. The place hadn't left much of an impression on me beyond the endless rows of tidy lawns and the faint smell of barbecue smoke drifting through the streets on summer evenings. But the letter was clear. The land was mine now, free and clear, and suddenly I felt a pull to return. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the possibility of a new beginning. Or maybe it was something deeper, something tied to my family's strange insistence that this land was special. My uncle had lived his whole life there, stubbornly resisting offers from developers and neighbors alike, insisting that the property stay in family hands. So I packed my things, loaded up my car, and made the drive. Hours passed, the landscape shifting from highways to tree-lined roads, until finally, the familiar subdivision came into view. Neat cul-de-sacs sprawled out like the arms of a spider. Identical houses with painted shutters and freshly trimmed hedges, giving off an eerie sense of perfection. It was the kind of place where conformity wasn't just expected, it was demanded. And at the heart of it, nestled at the edge of the development, was my land. When I pulled up, I was surprised to see that the property was different from the others. Where most homes were pressed together, each yard barely separated by fences, my uncle's land was expansive, nearly an acre, with a weathered old house set far back from the street. The grass was long, wildflowers sprouting along the edges, and a large oak tree stretched across the front yard, casting shadows over the driveway. Compared to the pristine uniformity of the neighborhood, it looked almost defiant, like it had resisted the pressure to conform for decades. That defiance, I would learn, was a sore point for some of the neighbors. It didn't take long before I noticed the stares, curtains twitching as I parked my car, a couple walking their dog slowing to glance, whispering behind cupped hands, and then the unmistakable presence of her. She was standing at the end of the driveway, arms folded, lips pursed so tightly they almost disappeared into her face. Perfectly coiffed hair, oversized sunglasses, a clipboard tucked under one arm like a weapon. Everything about her screamed authority, or at least the illusion of it. I hadn't even introduced myself yet, and I knew exactly who she was. Every neighborhood has one. The self-appointed enforcer, the gossip collector, the queen bee who lords over others with passive-aggressive comments and an iron will. And in a neighborhood with an HOA, such a figure had real power. She was the Karen of this place. And as fate would have it, she was about to become my greatest enemy. The moment I stepped out of the car, she advanced. Not a word of welcome, not even a polite smile. Just an immediate assault of presence, her posture sharp, her expression hard. Though she didn't speak aloud, her body language said everything. This was her domain, and I was already in violation simply for existing. Inside the house, I could still feel her eyes boring into me as I set down my bags. Dust coated the furniture, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and forgotten memories. But underneath it there was a warmth, a sense of belonging I hadn't expected. This was family land. My uncle had guarded it for decades, and now it was mine. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time cleaning, exploring the house, and walking the property. Every now and then, I'd see the Karen figure out on the street, watching, muttering into her phone, scribbling notes on that ever-present clipboard. It wasn't long before a letter arrived. Not a friendly welcome letter from a neighbor, but an official notice, the HOA. Apparently, the property had fallen into disrepair, and there were several violations that required immediate attention. The letter cited everything from the length of the grass to the color of the shutters. And at the bottom, signed in an elegant flourish, was her name, the Karen. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor, she was the head of the HOA board. That explained the hostility. It became clear what was happening. My uncle had resisted them for years, keeping the property outside their control. And now, with me moving in, they saw their chance. She saw her chance. To bring the land into line. To finally crush the one outlier that had defied the HOA's grasp. But what she didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that my uncle had been shrewd. He hadn't just left me the property. He had left me something else. A deed buried in the pile of documents, which stated plainly that not only was the land exempt from HOA control, but that the HOA itself owed him a portion of its operating budget in perpetuity, thanks to a deal struck when the development was first created. In other words, I wasn't under the HOA's authority. They were under mine. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. The power dynamic was reversed. All her bluster, her threats, her letters, they were meaningless. And if I chose to enforce it, she would be forced to answer to me. The irony was almost too perfect. When I returned to the land I inherited, the HOA Karen freaked out. But now I was her landlord. The thought made me smile. Yet deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Because people like her don't surrender easily. They fight, claw, and manipulate until the very end. And if she had spent years ruling this neighborhood like a queen, she wasn't going to accept being dethroned without a war. And so, the battle lines were drawn. The house was mine. The land was mine. The HOA technically answered to me, but she had something else, an entire community under her influence, willing to follow her lead, ready to enforce her will. It was going to be a fight unlike anything I had experienced. And as I stood in the doorway that evening, watching her glare at me from across the street, I felt the weight of it settling on my shoulders. This wasn't just about a house or a patch of land anymore. This was about power, control, and pride. And I was ready. The first week passed in uneasy silence. I had expected retaliation from the HOA after uncovering the truth about my deed, but what I hadn't expected was the scale of their determination. It didn't take long before the neighborhood began to shift against me, the hostility of one woman seeping into the minds of everyone around her like a slow-moving poison. At first, it was subtle. A neighbor's car parked deliberately close to the edge of my driveway, blocking my way out. Flyers for community standards left tucked under my windshield wipers, highlighting everything from lawn care to acceptable house colors. A garbage bin, mysteriously tipped over, spilling its contents across the corner of my yard late one night. But soon, the subtlety gave way to something more aggressive. I came home one afternoon to find a bright orange notice nailed to the oak tree in my front yard. It declared in bold capital letters that the property was in violation of multiple HOA standards and would be subject to fines until corrections were made. The language was firm, almost threatening, as though daring me to ignore it. But what struck me most was the signature at the bottom. Her name, again. That same looping flourish, signed with the authority she thought she possessed. The problem was she had no authority here. Not over me, not over my land. Still, she pressed on. It wasn't just letters and notices anymore. It was visits. Twice in a single week, she marched down my driveway uninvited, clipboard in hand, heels striking the concrete with precision as though she was inspecting a soldier's barracks. She would circle the property, jotting down notes, muttering under her breath, shaking her head with exaggerated disapproval. I never invited her in, and I never acknowledged her presence. But her message was clear. She wasn't going away, and the neighbors noticed. Her influence rippled outward. Lawn signs appeared overnight. Vague slogans like, "Keep our community beautiful and protect our standards." I recognized them for what they were, thinly veiled shots at me, meant to isolate me, to paint me as the outsider, the troublemaker, the one dragging down their perfect suburban utopia. But the more she pushed, the more I realized she was overplaying her hand, because I had something she didn't. Proof. Buried in the legal documents my uncle had left me was everything I needed. Copies of contracts, signatures from developers, clauses that carved my land out of HOA jurisdiction entirely. And not only that, evidence of the financial arrangement that made the HOA dependent on the property. Each year, a percentage of their operating funds came directly from the rights to utilities that ran beneath my land. My uncle had structured it brilliantly. They needed me far more than I needed them. It was almost laughable. She was parading around with her clipboard, acting like I was beneath her, while in reality, her precious HOA couldn't survive without the ground beneath my feet. So I made a choice. I decided not to confront her directly yet. Instead, I let her dig her hole deeper. The more she harassed me, the more leverage I had. And she was relentless. Notices piled up. Neighbors stopped making eye contact. At the grocery store, whispers trailed behind me as though I were some pariah contaminating their perfect little town. And all the while, she smiled. That smug, self-satisfied smile of someone who thought victory was inevitable. But her confidence blinded her. She didn't know I was keeping every notice, every letter, every scrap of paper with her signature. I was documenting her obsession, building a case brick by brick. It all came to a head one Friday evening. I was outside trimming branches near the oak tree when she approached, dressed impeccably as always, clipboard tucked under her arm. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she slammed a thick packet of papers onto my mailbox. I could see the words even from where I stood. Final notice before legal action. She was escalating. I didn't touch the papers right away. I waited until she walked away, until I saw her retreat across the street, satisfied with her performance. Then I picked them up and flipped through, page after page of alleged violations, threats of liens, demands for payment. It was almost impressive how far she had taken it, weaving together a fictional case as though sheer repetition could make it real. But by then, I knew it was time. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the packet spread out before me, my uncle's documents laid neatly beside it. Two conflicting realities. Her imagined authority and the actual legal truth. And in that moment, I understood what my uncle must have felt all those years, resisting her attempts to control this land. The pressure, the scrutiny, the endless barrage of petty demands. But I also understood the satisfaction he must have felt, knowing he held the ultimate card. I spent the weekend preparing, organizing files, cross-referencing dates, highlighting signatures. By the time Monday rolled around, I had assembled a binder thick enough to silence any doubters, and I was ready to play it. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening, in the community center just down the street. I hadn't planned on attending at first, but now it seemed almost poetic. She had spent weeks trying to drag me into her arena, parading her authority in front of neighbors. So I would give her what she wanted. I would show up. But I wouldn't come empty-handed. When I walked into the meeting, the room fell silent. Neighbors turned in their chairs, some glaring, others curious. At the front of the room sat the board, and at the center of it all, there she was. Her smile faltered for just a moment when she saw me holding that thick binder, but she recovered quickly, clearing her throat and launching into the meeting with her usual self-importance. I sat quietly, listening, waiting. The agenda rolled on. Budget updates, landscaping concerns, pool maintenance. And then inevitably my name, my property. She launched into a speech about community standards, about fairness, about the need to maintain order. The words were polished, practiced, dripping with authority. But as she spoke, I could see the cracks, a twitch in her jaw, a bead of sweat near her hairline. And when she finally turned to me, expecting me to crumble under the weight of her accusations, I simply opened the binder. The sound echoed in the quiet room. Pages flipping, documents sliding into view. Her eyes narrowed, confusion giving way to something sharper. And then I spoke, not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with calm certainty. I laid out the facts. The exemption, the financial ties, the signatures that bound the HOA, not me. The room shifted, gasps, murmurs, eyes darting between her and me. The queen bee suddenly stripped of her crown. By the time I finished, the silence was deafening. She tried to recover, of course. She stammered about outdated documents, about misunderstandings, about needing time to review. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted in the very community she had controlled for so long. I left the meeting with my head held high, the binder under my arm, the weight of years of her tyranny cracking under the pressure of truth. But as I walked back to my property that night, I knew it wasn't over. People like her don't surrender. They regroup. They scheme. They come back sharper, more dangerous. And judging by the look in her eyes as I left that meeting, she was already planning her next move. The war had only just begun. The red notice from the city stayed taped to my refrigerator for days, a constant reminder of how far Karen was willing to go. She had already lost the petition fight. She had already been exposed in front of the community. But humiliation hadn't stopped her, it had only fueled her. And now, with the threat of condemnation hanging over me, she believed she had found her final weapon. But what she didn't realize was that this was the moment I had been waiting for. For weeks, I had been documenting everything: the harassment, the vandalism, the intimidation, the coercion. Every photograph, every letter, every witness statement. I had built a case so strong it no longer belonged to me alone. It belonged to anyone who had ever suffered under her control. The hearing to review the condemnation complaint was scheduled for a Thursday evening at City Hall. It wasn't just another HOA meeting or a neighborhood gathering. This was official, binding, final, and it would decide the fate of my land. The room was packed when I arrived. City officials sat at the front, flanked by clerks and recorders. Rows of folding chairs filled the hall, every seat taken by neighbors, curious residents, and even a few reporters who had caught wind of the escalating feud. The air was thick with anticipation, whispers buzzing like static. And then she entered. Karen walked in with her head held high, dressed sharper than ever, her confidence radiating like armor. She carried her own binder this time, thick with papers, her weapon against me. She smiled at her supporters, patted shoulders, whispered reassurances. She looked like a politician ready to claim victory. The hearing began. She was called first. Her speech was rehearsed, polished, almost theatrical. She painted a grim picture of my property, unsafe, unkempt, a hazard to children, a danger to the community. She spoke of community values, of protecting investments, of the need to preserve harmony. Every sentence dripped with manipulation. Every phrase carefully chosen to tug at fear and pride. She even produced photographs, selectively angled shots of my yard, exaggerated claims of damage and disrepair. She pointed to neighbors in the audience who nodded dutifully, their loyalty bought through years of intimidation. For a moment, it almost worked. I could see some officials leaning forward, their pens scratching across notepads, their faces grave, and then it was my turn. I walked to the podium, the binder heavy in my hands. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match her theatrics. I simply began to speak, one page at a time. I presented the deed, signed and sealed, proving the land's exemption from HOA control. I laid out the financial ties between the HOA and my property, showing that their survival depended on it, not mine. I shared photos of vandalism, reports of harassment, testimony from neighbors who admitted to being coerced, and then I produced the most damning piece of all, a video clip. One of my neighbors, tired of the harassment, had installed a security camera facing the street, and on it, clear as day, was Karen, spray paint can in hand, standing in the shadows by my house, scrawling "Get out" across the siding before scurrying away. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, shock rippling like a wave, her face drained of color. She tried to speak, to protest, but the officials banged the gavel, silencing the chaos. They studied the footage, compared it to the photographs of the vandalism, and there was no denying it. It was her, the queen bee of the HOA, caught red-handed. The officials turned cold. They questioned her sharply, their tone no longer deferential but accusatory. And for the first time she faltered. Her words tangled, her confidence cracked, her composure shattered. By the end of the hearing, the decision was unanimous. The complaint against my property was dismissed entirely. The land was declared safe, exempt, and protected under the original deed. And as for her, sanctions were imposed. She was removed from the HOA board, effective immediately, barred from holding any leadership role in the community. It was over. The silence in the room as the decision was announced was deafening. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, the foundation of their world shaken. The woman who had ruled them with a clipboard and a smile had been exposed as a vandal, a liar, a bully. I walked out of City Hall that night not just with my property secured, but with the weight of victory pressing heavily on my shoulders. The land was mine, free and clear, just as my uncle had intended. And Karen, in the weeks that followed, her presence faded. The porch light that had once glared from across the street stayed dark. Her perfect lawn grew patchy, her pristine shutters faded. Without power, without control, she seemed to shrink, retreating into the shadows she had once commanded. Rumors spread that she had put her house up for sale, unable to face the community she had once dominated. The neighborhood slowly began to breathe again. Without her iron grip, small acts of individuality appeared. Colorful shutters, new gardens, lawn decorations. People waved to me now, some even apologized quietly for their silence. The spell had been broken, and through it all, I remembered the words my uncle had once said, words buried in the papers he left behind. This land is more than property. It's freedom. Don't let anyone take that from you. I hadn't. Karen had freaked out when I returned to the land I inherited. She had fought, schemed, and destroyed herself in the process. And in the end, I wasn't just her landlord, I was her downfall. And that's how the HOA Karen who tried to run my life ended up losing everything. She went from threatening to evict me to being exposed, humiliated, and stripped of her power in front of the entire community. The land I inherited didn't just protect me, it made me her landlord. And in the end, her downfall. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more unbelievable neighborhood dramas, and let me know in the comments. What would you have done if Karen came after you?